So yeah, let's welcome everybody today. Also, Alan or Dr. Alan Ansel from Nashville. Hi, Alan. How you doing?
Hey, how are you?
I'm
Thanks for
great.
having
So
me.
yeah, I'm really interested to see today what Alan can teach us on permaculture and design thinking. Actually, I know Alan from my own permaculture course. I did the course with him, my design certificate, and yeah, that course, like I like to mention, was life-changing. Learning about permaculture and how permaculture can actually change our lives, and that's basically how we met each other. And now today we would like to talk about design thinking and how design thinking could be approached from a permaculture perspective, and that's basically changes the story quite a bit. So now let me show you the agenda for today. If you have any questions, you can always write your questions in the chat, like I mentioned before. And I have your microphones muted by default from the participants, so we don't have any interferences. If you would like to say something on the microphone during the question and answer sessions, don't worry, I can turn it on. Just write in the chat, and then that's no problem. But that way, we keep the communication clean. Okay, so today's agenda is basically, yeah, first we did the who's who. So we introduced Enzo. I'm Philip. I'm here in Spain, and I'm the founder of Seeds for Sustainability, School for Sustainability and Healthy Living. And I'm really happy to have you guys here today. And the next thing we're going to look at is design thinking. We're going to define what is design thinking, and then we look at beyond design thinking and sustainable design and systems thinking. Then we will dive into the permaculture design. After that, we have a first chance to ask Alan some questions and little interaction. So if you have any questions on the topics that I mentioned before, then that's the first chance. Then we go a bit deeper into permaculture principles and how they apply to design. Then again, another Q&A, and at the end, we would like to give you some practical examples to make the theory more vivid. And then we have some calls to action. So what actually is the scope of today's webinar? So we will know the basics of design thinking. We will know the basics of sustainable design thinking. We will get to know the ethics and principles of permaculture design. And then we will learn the basics of natural system design, ecological design. And hopefully at the end, we can make some positive changes in our lives, or at least get some inspiration. And we have a little exercise for you at the end to contemplate and see how we can change design thinking with permaculture. So now, actually, I would like to hand over to Ellen, and you just let me know when I skip the slides. And now we enjoy Enzo. So thank you.
All right, well, everybody, welcome. This is a talk about design. Design is something being thought about a lot right now because, for instance, with supply chains, we're seeing there's a lot of bad design out there. And everywhere we look with the environment and even with the physical products, a lot of bad design is out there. So there's a lot of opportunity for designers to learn more about the best ways to design going forward in the future, especially incorporating sustainability. So we'll talk about design thinking, and that term has been very popular recently. It really is started to be very particular to the field of product development. So physical products, people talk about design thinking a lot. This concept has been around since the 1970s, and it started with a designer named Richard Buchanan. He coined the term wicked problems. So this refers to when you have a problem that's complex or ambiguous and open to constant reinterpretation. Some problems require, a different approach to the linear process of solving problems that especially corporations historically have used. So design thinking can be defined as a nonlinear iterative process which seeks to understand users, seeks to challenge assumptions, redefine problems, and create innovative solutions to prototype and test. And that definition is from the Interaction Design Foundation, one of the leaders in putting forth this whole concept of design thinking with the special focus on product development. Now, design thinking is gaining in popularity now due to several large multinational corporations using the ideas in an attempt to approach product development with outside the box thinking. So we can go down to the different stages. Philip, next. Yeah, okay. So these are the 5 stages of design thinking. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So these start with empathize. You want to understand the user and the problem you're trying to solve through user research. So this is typically done through a human-centered process, methods such as interviews, focus groups, and surveys. So if you have a product, especially a physical product where this is used, there might be some ergonomic issues with the product that need to be ironed out. And a lot of times those things are only discovered if you do some user research and focus groups and surveys to find out that there's a problem with your product. So after you do the research, stage 2 would be define. You need to define the core problems and how you're gonna, what you've identified through your research, and create a statement to define how you're going to fix the problem with the new iteration of the product. Ideate, stage 3. This is when you challenge assumptions, and it's the 3rd stage of design thinking. It means thinking outside of the box and looking for alternative ways to view the problem and identify innovative solutions to the problem statement you created in number 2, which is define. Again, where you can see the focus on physical product development, we go to stage 4, which is where you prototype and you start to create solutions. And this is to, identify solutions to the problems you identified in the first 3 stages. Design teams will typically produce a number of inexpensive scaled down versions of the product with the specific features that are intended to correct the design issues and work out solutions. And stage 5 is test. Rigorously test the completed product, and oftentimes when you test out the product, you'll find new problems that you need to look at, and new refinements to the product, and look at new alternative solutions. So that is the 5 stages that are commonly used. Now the big idea, and the reason that design thinking is so popular, is because it's not this linear process of we create a design, we put it out there on the market. It's more of a feedback loop that constantly comes back to improving the product. And that's a good idea. Now, the purpose of this talk is to talk about the evolution of design, the evolution of design thinking. So we're going to go to the next slide, Philip. Okay, beyond design thinking. So in the 1970s, 80s, we started to hear more about sustainability, and maybe not that word, but you know, more ecological, more supply chain management, using quote unquote sustainable sources for products, and using better ingredients and local sourced materials. These are all ideas that are bringing sustainability into um, the whole practice of design thinking. So as we said, design thinking as it's normally used out there is conventionally focused on physical product development. And a lot of universities lately have included the concept in the field of software design. Now, if you go outside of the field of product development and software design, we encounter some problems trying to use the core 5 steps of design thinking. And this is where we get into sustainable design. So unfortunately, design thinking does not formally incorporate sustainability into the process, which is problematic. But stage 1 of the formal design thinking, empathize, or stage 2, define, they may include input from users about the desire for sustainability related product attributes, but sustainability itself is not included as a default part of design thinking. So if we take design thinking to the next level, we enter the realm of sustainable design. And let's see if we're on the right slide there, Phil.
Yeah, now we have some different forms of sustainable design.
Okay.
And yeah, nowadays, what we see right now, for example, coming up in Europe is circular economy or cradle to cradle. And you also mentioned that. So maybe you can explain everybody what that concept is. And then we have the biomimicry, for example, that's another topic we have here, and zero waste design. So maybe a couple of thoughts on that so people know what they can understand on that.
Okay. Now, before we get into that, the the whole vision of bringing sustainability into product development, into design thinking, there's a very core philosophy that was popularized in the 70s and 80s called the 7th generation principle. And that's based on an ancient Iroquois philosophy, 7th generation. The decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. This philosophy is currently, overused in the green marketing ploy to sell everything from dish soap to cars to everything else you see out there. We saw the term green being overused. Now we are currently seeing the overuse of the term sustainability. Things that aren't really truly sustainable are being labeled as such. And it seems, every month there's a new catchphrase, a new term. Everybody on this call has probably seen the increase in the use of the term regenerative. You see that all over the place these days. And it's a new buzzword, but each generation of these terms are really trying to get at the same core philosophy, which is we need to design things in a better way, in a more sustainable way. And all these various iterations of models of design with sustainability have been created. And we see these in the 3 that we've chosen here to talk about. It started with cradle to grave design, which is how do we design this thing to go from cradle to first creation of it using materials that are pulled from the earth, Now, hopefully those materials are pulled from sustainable sources, ideally localized sources. And the next iteration of Cradle to Grave was Cradle to Cradle. So it's making it a full circle of design where, say, at the end product, waste from one system becomes input from another. Or waste from one system can be safely returned to the environment. So examples of this are food containers that are compostable, downcycling plastic, computer cases, for instance, into plastic bottles, using offcuts from one process to make more of the same product. Example of that would be when you're making cookies and you use a cookie cutter and you use all the dough flattened out. Well, in between, there's dough that's not being used. But you could put all that dough together, make another round, and you get more out of it. So that kind of recycling in mind. Biomimicry design is also very popular, and that's emulating patterns and ideas found in nature. Examples of this would be camouflage that we see in animals being used in military applications. The Japanese bullet train design. That train was designed after the kingfisher bird. The shape of the bird, what was happening with the design of the bullet train is it goes too fast. I think it's 200 kilometers an hour. And when it would come out of tunnels, they would get a big sonic boom. And they had to figure out how to design the train to stop this. And they ended up with the kingfisher, the bird, its beak, and the way it flies, and its very aerodynamic shape. And by designing the train with that specific shape, they were able to eliminate that sonic problem in the train. And so that's a good example. Now, in natural building, which is very popular, especially in the permaculture world, they developed natural climate control systems. And some of these are based on systems that we see used in nature, for instance, termite mounds. A termite mound goes up like this, and there's a hole at the top. You have airflow coming in the bottom and naturally going up through the termite mound, and it creates fresh air. It creates the perfect climate modulation of the temperature in the mound. So we use those natural systems that we see in nature to improve designs that humans need and create, in this example, for natural buildings. And even skyscrapers can use those same techniques. So let's go to, let me talk about zero waste design. Zero waste design is typically spoken of in terms of architecture. And that's using sustainable materials and trying to get to the product, the end product or the end building with the minimal waste possible, if possible, zero. So that's another example of sustainable design being included in modern systems. So let's go to, what's the next one, Philip? Systems thinking. Okay, well, we're talking about design thinking, but when we bring in sustainability to the equation, we're bringing in the environment. We're starting to think about supply chains. We're starting to think about where we're getting materials. And this is widening the scope of our thought processes and our ideas. And what we call it's an ecological mindset. You're looking at the ecology. You're looking at everything around, everything involved in this process. So system thinking is also, it differs from the traditional linear and reductionist analytical view of problem solving. And systems thinking realizes that all systems are composed of interconnected parts that interact. As a result, behavior of the system may change and evolve over time. And so we have to think about the entire system and how each change in the system that we create would affect the overall system. Now, the roots of systems thinking are found in disciplines such as biology and ecology, where many environmental factors may interact to affect individuals embedded in a given ecosystem. By observing patterns in interactions, we can better design products and systems that are resilient to changes from outside the system. So systems in this context may include complex biological systems, a family, a larger community, or even a small company, large company. And by understanding how systems work, and by understanding the various actors and roles in a given system, we can more effectively design products and solutions to problems that we have. Examples of systems thinking include organic grocery chains investing in organic farms. That would be vertical integration. Manufacturers using zero waste processes. And another example would be introducing multidisciplinary learning activities in education outside of the traditional one-dimensional subjects in curriculum that we see used today. So let's go to the next one, Philip.
Yeah, I had a quick question to you actually, and just to see, because when we think now that we introduced design or system thinking, that's basically one of the major differences from like the normal design thinking, because like you mentioned before, and when you have the linear or the normal, just the normal design thinking, which is already different from the linear, okay, but then since there's no ecology included, no one thinks about how the waste is going, so the system, let's call it, or the planet, is not considered at all, right? So this is one of the biggest differences now where we enter to permaculture design, for example, or like thinking of systems is not done so far in design thinking. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that it's not done. As we talked about, there are opportunities to bring in sustainability and systems thinking and other ideas. And this is the whole reason that design thinking is so popular, is because people realize that you can improve it by bringing in new ideas and new systems.
Okay, so now I go to the next slide then. Okay.
And let me, hold on just a second.
Don't worry. Yeah, so, and after this section, just so everybody knows, we will have chances to have questions. So if you have questions already, just maybe write them down for yourself, and in a couple of minutes you'll be able also to ask the first couple of questions. But now we will go into permaculture design.
Okay, well, we're going to take the jump into sustainable design, and a lot of people would say permaculture design is sustainable design, and we can argue about that all day long. Some people would say they're the same thing. So we will talk about permaculture design. It was started in the 70s by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. And permaculture is basically just what they call a portmanteau, which is when you push several words together, two words together, two terms together, and make it into one term. So we're talking about the original idea of permanent agriculture and permanent culture. Um, Now, in permanent agriculture, all we're talking about there is agriculture and animal management, which improves the quality of the land, provides income and produce, and is sustainable now and in the future. When we talk about permanent culture, we're talking about a means of conserving and supporting and working together with the local culture, while at the same time moving forward, working with nature and people, as well as learning from them, and not working against or in competition with other people. So with permaculture, it helps us to understand and create harmonious integrations between people and nature in the most sustainable way. Permaculture is appropriate for urban, rural situations, as well as for all scales, all kinds of projects. It includes traditional practices of nature management, integrated with appropriate modern technology. It's a holistic, kind, and environmental friendly way of designing and building our natural living environment, as well as improving living standards, including housing, water supply, health, waste management, farming, energy, rivers, forests, livestock management, and more. Let's see, permaculture design is now practiced in over 130 countries by thousands of permaculture designers, teachers, and consultants around the world. Permaculture is a systems design tool. Now, you can see in this list here on the presentation that there are some similarities with systems thinking and design thinking. And basically, we're talking about an evolution of design thinking through sustainability and through to permaculture design. Now, one of the best features of permaculture design is that it's often used when we're attempting to repair sick systems or systems that have failed or don't work. There's my quote right there, probably the shortest definition of permaculture you'll ever come across right there. There's so much involved in permaculture that it's hard to come up with an elevator speech to describe it. And basically, in permaculture, we try to apply it to everything we need in order to build a sustainable future. And commonly, initiatives are taken to and evolve from strategies that focus on efficiency. For instance, more accurate and controlled uses of inputs and minimization of waste. Now we can also talk about permaculture using substitution. For example, more or less from disruptive interventions such as biocides and chemical agriculture and things that damage the planet to more benign alternatives in working with nature. And redesign. Like we were saying at the beginning, there are so many broken systems and bad design out there that we have all of these opportunities to redesign everything. And this is one of the key design systems that we use when we talk about redesigning those systems.
So can I ask you a question quickly and or make a comment, because this is something people may confuse. They think of permaculture and they only think of agriculture. And you made your point that it's more applicable, but maybe you can we can, let's say, turn that out of the world, or like eliminate that thought that permaculture is just for agriculture, and maybe you can clear that up one more time so people really know that permaculture is more than that. Maybe a couple of thoughts on that.
Well, you can use this design system to design anything from business. For instance, we talked about cleaning up the supply chain, sourcing things locally. Um, those are examples of, you know, not just for agriculture. It's very much um, about design and not about agriculture. Now, one of the reasons that you often see, I mean, very often see permaculture equated with sustainable agriculture is because that's where it's used. Now, in the 70s, when we had a lot of intentional communities and eco-villages popping up around the United States and the world, people were looking for a different way to live. And one of the best examples are these intentional communities and eco-villages around the world. And what's the first thing they needed to figure out is how are we going to grow our own food? Well, the reason that permaculture is so popular in those contexts is because permaculture represents a toolkit of all of those techniques and models and design ideas that allow you to work with nature and design the systems you need to grow your own food naturally, locally, um, and at the with the lowest human work input. And so it makes a lot of sense why they would incorporate permaculture naturally, because for a large community, you're obviously not going to be talking about buying large $1 million pieces of machinery and get into industrial agriculture to support. Completely unnecessary. There are systems that have been adopted from ancient traditions, indigenous people traditions, and this is where permaculture shines, is because we are bringing together those indigenous techniques, the traditional ecological knowledge systems, and also marrying that with the best sustainable modern technologies such as solar panels and renewable energy systems. So all of these problems, including income streams, small business, all of these things, the way you build, natural building, there's a lot more involved in just agriculture. So, but you can see how that's where people get tied up with equating it with sustainable agriculture, because that's one of the easiest, that's the first area that you need to talk about. Where am I going to get my water? Where am I going to get my food?
Yeah, sure.
So of course, that's one of the best places to think about permaculture design, because it really shines in that area. And that's, I hope that helps a little. I can give.
Of course. Yeah. I think now we're going to the ethics, but we already have some questions, which I just want to mention. There are already 2 or 3 questions, but I think after this slide, we have the first question and answer session. So maybe just some words then on the ethics, and after that I think we can then already go to the first Q&As, since there's interesting questions in the chat. I don't want to leave people waiting so long, but we need some more basics, and then we'll have some Q&As. So now back to you, Ansel.
Well, when we talk about permaculture design, we start with the ethics. Now, we discussed a little bit of this before when we talked about the emergence of sustainable design. The ethics and sustainability, for instance, are not normally included as a default process in design thinking. And when we talk about ethics, I mean, this gets sticky, because when you talk about ethics, bringing ethics into the design of things, that can be a sticky word, because some people equate ethics with morals, and but that's not, we don't want to get confused with any of that. We're talking about just basic ethics and a way to frame mindset that we're using to design things, to design agriculture, to design our homes, to design our lifestyles, to design our income streams, and our lifestyles. So with permaculture, earth care, people care, future care. And you can see the list there. We have some other examples of each of those, but these are the things that we have in the back of our mind when we're designing with permaculture. And it could be anything, like I said. So now, if conventional product design started with some sort of ethics, then the decision to make a given unsustainable product would not happen. Now, some physical product manufacturers will only add sustainable and clean features when forced to do so by government regulators or consumer advocacy groups. And so by incorporating ethics into the product and systems development voluntarily and as a default part of the process, designers are telling the story that to the public that the organization has a higher sense of social responsibility in comparison to other producers. With ethics, when someone knows that company X has an ethical mindset and they do everything ethically and sustainably, the product users can sense that the organization cares for their well-being on some level, which translates into increased customer loyalty and increased sales. So that's a lot, and let's go to some questions. So
yeah, exactly. We already have some cool questions here in the chat. I will read out a bit to make it a bit easier, and then everybody else, of course, is free too. So here's one question that came first. I'll read out the text. So we are mainly into, there's a company, and they say we are mainly into organic produce e-commerce, but also work with farmers to create a financially stable plan. Of late, we have been receiving a lot of requests from our friends, customers, and some investors to help them create a farm. I personally have been recommending going for a permaculture-based farm, knowing the benefits. However, now the question, however, is there a step-by-step plan which can be used to create these farms? So like, what is the off-scratch approach for permaculture? And then knowing these vary by geographic locations, and India is no different. Any advice will be great on this regard. So thank you for that question. Yeah, I pass it over to you.
No, there is no set template that you can use for permaculture design, because number one, it depends on the needs of the people involved. Number two, it depends on the location and the natural systems that you have in the area. So it is place-based, it is context-oriented, and this is why we have designers, because it's cannot be just put in a template and say, here you go. This is why we need designers to, for instance, when you're designing a farm, you would go spend time on the land. You need to observe and interact with the land and the systems. Spending time on the land, you will be able to get vital information about energies coming onto the land. So where does the water flow? How does the water flow? Do I have monsoon that affects this area and washes out this whole area of land here? If so, I may not want to put my intensive vegetable gardening area anywhere near that. So you only learn these things by being at that location and observing and interacting with the land. So that's a good example that there is no template, and that's why we have designers that go all over the world and help people design these systems. Now, Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture design, suggested that, you know, a great idea for people in that position, number one, you can hire a permaculture designer. Number two, you can take the permaculture design certificate course and you can learn how to design yourself. And that's a great idea that we recommend for people, especially corporations and organizations, nonprofits, groups taking the course together to learn how can we help our local community with redesigning farms. We have a lot of unsustainable farms and farms that are based in old systems of GMOs and industrial agriculture models that need to be changed over. A lot of the earth used in these unsustainable ways is degraded. They can be brought back to life, you know, sometimes in short terms, 2-3 years, even for lands that have been degraded with hazardous chemicals. You can bring that back with some of these permaculture design techniques and tools, bring it back into healthy production. But anyway, the short answer is it's context-based. So you need to look at everything happening and the ecological, the ecosystem involved, and go from there.
Yeah, it's funny that I was about to mention the course too, because in the end, when you learn how to be a designer, yeah, you have certain things that you can check off, like you just mentioned, no, the energy analysis, element analysis. So there's certain techniques that you learn, and and when you go through all of these different steps, basically that's the off scratch, so to say, template, but there's no, like you say, no common approach. But that's a good thing about learning, being a permaculture designer. At least myself, I got a completely different view on things from looking at one thing in a narrow view to more holistic, and now you see interconnections between elements everywhere. And yeah, sometimes it can be how you say, it's something, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad in a way, because once you start thinking in a system, things are not so straightforward anymore. But obviously we are in a system, so we need to think in systems, but it's not so linear, and that's why it's more complicated. But that's why we also need to learn these techniques. So there's another question actually, and it goes towards the packaging industry. And the question is, like, how could we actually apply permaculture to packaging? That was a question here.
Well, we have some actually pictures that include sustainable packaging. We have sandwich containers and to-go carry-out containers for restaurants that are fully compostable. We have containers that are made from recycled banana leaves. We have packaging peanuts, you know, the things that the white little peanuts used to be made from polyester, which is completely unsustainable. It's plastic made from crude oil. Now we have those packing peanuts, which are helping to resolve the shock of something that's packed in a box. Packing peanuts that are made with plants, all kinds of plant material. And it just, like Philip's other webinar that he had about hemp, you know, almost everything can be made from hemp. It's sustainable, but we have, you know, outdated laws, especially in the US, about growing it, and other countries are growing it and making all kinds of things, including sustainable packaging with hemp. So there are sustainable solutions out there for all of these problems. It's just a matter of perhaps being in the environment where those things are not outlawed by, you know, the governments and corporations involved with the unsustainable packaging industry.
Yeah, and actually it's a really good example, and I'm glad you mentioned the hemp because I'm completely fascinated still about hemp and all it can do. I mean, just to give you a heads up on for those who haven't seen the webinar yet, I just strongly recommend you go to the YouTube channel. We have it there, and I mean, you can make batteries from hemp, which are non-toxic and perfect for electric cars, and they can be disposed and is biodegradable. I mean, that's one of the main things. Something Enzo also mentioned. What happens then after the cycle, no? And when we think about circular economy, they also mention that recycling itself is not such a good thing, maybe because most of the time you downcycle products, and lots of energy often is used to recycle them when we have the normal design still, and also maybe toxic materials might still be created. So that's where basically then when we apply permaculture, like we'll see that later, the principles, like for example, create no waste. Yeah, so before thinking how to design the whole product, we have to think about what's going to be at the end, and we don't want to produce any waste. Yeah, so that's basically obviously applicable now to the packaging industry. So before you design your product, think about what happens after using the product, and is it, for example, biodegradable or not. Just that also is a high discussion now here in Europe, for example, when we think about circular economy, and these are the points mentioned. So there's one more question, well, a couple more questions maybe. Let's see. Um, yeah, I mean, people mentioning here in the chat that those things unfortunately are not done yet. So there's a lot of waste created. So things we mentioned. Let's see. There's another question from regarding the permaculture farm, but I'm afraid maybe it's not easily answered, but I will still give it to you. The question is it advised to introduce free-range cattle and poultry in these permaculture areas? We have advised aquatics, but not free-range cattle. So that's basically the question.
The one of the one of the most popular design tools regarding livestock would be a cell grazing system. So it would be free range, but what you would do is you would cordon off an area, let the cattle be in that area for a given amount of time while they're grazing, and then move them to a different cell. So you create different cells across the farm and you move them strategically. So what you could do is move the cattle up to a different cell, and in the place that they were, you would do something different there. You would introduce chickens, perhaps introduce pigs, or there are several techniques to use that land in a cell grazing fashion to where the end product would be to create crops and to create produce while also rotating those animals that you have in a productive way to prepare the land for the next thing that you're doing. So that's one of the systems that is commonly used.
Yeah, there's another question, actually comment, and I would like to hear your answer on that because I have my own, but I would like to hear yours first. Saying sustainable agriculture cannot include cattle. Provocative statement. Let's see what you think about that.
That is a provocative statement. And of course, these things could be battled back and forth, but it can include cattle if you're doing it in a sustainable way. Now, what I just described was the cell grazing system. You can look at producers such as Joel Salatin, who sustainably manages cattle in a permaculture designed farm system. And cattle is producing very good product in the form of manure that can be used to improve the land for the next thing you're doing. So I think you know, one of the most destructive things about cattle is that they trample the land and you have a degraded landscape, but that only happens if the cattle are left in one area for a long period of time. So there are techniques to grow after cattle have left an area to regenerate that area by growing things, for instance, root crops, and doing things like crop rotations that involve crops that go deep into the soil. Now, those things will break up the soil and it won't be compacted anymore and damaged from the cattle. So by switching out what is happening in a given cell, in a given area of your farm, you can keep regenerating the land. And so you have a system where you have cattle, and then you have chickens, and then you have some sort of crops that break up the soil again and bring fertility back. Then you have the crop that you want to grow to make money with. And then you go back to having cattle in that area. So you can, you know, I'm not a farmer, but I do know about a lot of these systems being used in permaculture, and that's one of them. So it depends. If you're doing it in the old-fashioned way that ranches have been done with cattle, then yes, it can be destructive. You'll end up with degraded land, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are a lot of examples of people doing it in a more intelligent way.
Yeah, I also have some thoughts on that. There's two more comments on that. One is too high methane gas, too high water consumption, which means socially unjust on systems levels. Yes, I would say that if done in the bad way. But consider the following example: you have a permaculture design, you catch your rainwater, so you have abundance of water to start with. So water should not always be an issue, not necessarily. And then the feed, if you don't have thousands of cows, you can actually grow your own. Yeah? So it's not necessarily unsustainable to grow food, especially when we talk about permaculture and agroforestry, where you can have trees, like for example the locust tree. It's great feed for cattle. It produces so much food, and it's even regenerating the soil, capturing so much CO2 that it's a super tree. So it depends on the size. If you also look at the UN report on sustainable farming, they say the world cannot be fed on the system we have. We have to go back to small scale farming. And when it comes to the gases, consider chickens, or when you have a chicken coop that is surrounded by trees, in a natural environment, or then they even free range, all the gas and manure that is produced can actually feed the trees, and then they capture even more CO2. So we have to look at the whole equation. And if it's done in the conventional way, obviously it's a bad thing, but it depends on design. It really depends on the design, and that's what Enzo mentioned earlier. We have to look at the energies that are on the ground, and sometimes when you produce too much of something, it can be toxic. That's going back to Paracelsus, who's saying the toxicity of something depends on the dose. So if you have small scale, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So just that's something that we, I guess, can discuss until forever. And that's why I'm also always a bit skeptical when people say go vegan to save the planet, which also is too general, because many people that are vegan, then they have to be feeding lots of soy products, and if they are not done or grown in a correct way, it's a lot of monoculture, and we have the same problems associated with vegan products. So we can't generalize. That's basically my main point here. Let's see if there's more questions, but I think we could go back to the presentation since we still have some stuff to go, and we have another Q&As later. And let's see, I don't want to overskip anybody. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, like I said, the discussion on if it's sustainable to have cattle or not, I guess it's never ending. But I go back to my conclusion. It depends on the design, and you have to know all the produce, that is all the outputs. We see that now in the next couple of slides. When we do an element analysis, we see the outputs, and the gases would be one of them, maybe not a good one. and you have to have system capacity. That's why we talk about system design. If the whole system is able to capture the stuff that is produced on the site, then no problems emerge. But we have problems when we have leakages of system, which means too much methane or too much CO2 or too much waste, too much manure, which is then toxic. If the system cannot capture the outputs, then we have a problem. But that's a design issue. It's not a general per se a bad thing. Well, that's just my point of view. But I guess let's go back to the presentation, and I hope I didn't cut off anybody. If so, please write a question again, and we'll go back to that in the next Q&A. So now we mentioned some things already, talking about natural systems design, and how is that now incorporated into permaculture. Now back to you.
Okay, you can see we're moving into one of the key strengths of permaculture design is looking at the natural systems and designing with the natural energies that are found in the environment, in the ecosystem that we're talking about, or in the system, in the case of physical products, the supply chain and the local materials that you have available to you. Just like systems thinking, you can see here, we're talking about everything is connected to everything else. Special permaculture principles here are every function is supported by many elements. Every element should serve many functions. So if we look at do you have the next slide? The web of life. No, let's see. No, not that one, go back.
Yeah. Now the web of life, from the source to sink, I didn't put on the slides. This is
okay. So what is design? Design is composed of two elements: aesthetics and function. Permaculture design concentrates on function, and nature provides aesthetics. So when you design something with in a natural way, it's automatically beautiful. Nature provides the aesthetics. Now, source to sink. Source to sink is a model used by ecologists to talk about how variations in habitat quality affect the growth or decline of organisms. And this involves, talking about the web of life. Man is merely a strand in the web of life, and whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. And that's a quote from Chief Seattle. Now, in natural systems design, in permaculture, we start with element analysis. So if you're looking at an industrial process that's going to produce a product, or if you're going to look at a farm, you have lots of different elements that are going to be put together in this farm to create a working integrated system. In the conventional industrial farm, there are none of these connections. It's not interacting with inputs and outputs, matching. A lot of waste in the system, a lot of degradation of the soil and land. And this is what we're eliminating by using ecological systems thinking. So with the element analysis, you're looking at the needs in the products, or you can say inputs and outputs. And we're looking at what will each element produce or contribute, and how many resources will it consume, or what inputs does it need? How much effort do you need to maintain it? What we would do in a typical design is look at all the elements in a given system. Say we have a chicken house, and we have a greenhouse and we have a garden, there's going to be a place where we need to deal with compost, and that compost can feed into the garden. We can take the bedding from the chickens, the used bedding after it's dirty, and put it in the compost pile. And after some more composting, we can use that on the soil to increase the productivity of the soil and to feed the nutrients, the soil biota, and we end up with more nutrient dense food. So everything from the house to the water systems to the food growing systems, including renewable energy systems that we need, all of those things can be designed to interact and work together, producing an integrated design with zero waste. So that's the whole goal of designing with permaculture. And in addition to the ethics, we have the permaculture principles. And we want to make this download available for everybody with the permaculture principles. This is great information that you can use for designing products or designing agriculture systems or designing homesteads, or even small business, large business. So let's talk about one of the principles that has to relate to design thinking is redundancy. Have a backup plan, be prepared. For every critical need, provide multiple ways of meeting that need. So your critical needs are water, food, money, heating, the toilet, social and political power. Those, for every one of those, you want to have multiple ways of meeting it. So for instance, when we're designing a system and obviously we need water. Well, here at our house, we might have the city water from the tap. We might have rainwater harvesting that we catch in cisterns, and we have that available. And we have a well. So this right there, there's 3 ways of getting that vital resource that we need. If you use that same kind of thinking in the design of systems to create a product, then you could say, okay, well, I use this input, this material to make my product. But what if this material is not available? I have to have another as a backup. And ideally, you would want to make that sustainable and locally sourced, something that you could turn to if the original material that you use is not available. So that's a good example of both how to use it in farm, homestead, and industry.
Yeah, just one quick, and before I go to the next principle, like you mentioned before, at the end of today, I will give you, and so he made a little ebook, like a little reader for you, where you can find the information from today with more details. So yeah, don't worry if you miss something. Also, the presentation you can have. That's just, I want to add that. So now I can go to the next principle. Oops.
Yep.
Let's see. Okay, that's it.
Multiple functions. We call it stacking functions, or stacking, wearing multiple hats. So every element in the design will have more than one function. Ideally, it has 3. So if you're putting these elements together, each element should perform a range of functions. Now, when we look at a tree that's planted, do you have that image, or is that only in the ebook? Okay.
So we're looking at
a tree. A tree is planted to provide food, mulch, shelter for the garden or house, soil conditioning, water harvesting, provides nutrients for other plants, and water retention, oxygen. So you can see it performs a range of functions, and it's a good element to have in a natural system.
I just shared the part of the ebook, so here you can see it
Oh,
too.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and now we'll go back to the presentation. Yeah, you can see how what just answer meant. One element serves multiple function, and that's obviously a clear difference also to the conventional design moment that we use at the moment, basically.
Okay, so design from patterns to details. Get the bigger picture before you start deciding on the details. What we do in permaculture is we look at the overall patterns that exist. We look at the landscapes, the landforms, and how the wind comes across into the area that we're designing. The energies, the sunlight, the wind, the water, how water acts on the landscape that we're designing. Same with houses and other structures. And you can use that same in physical product development. So we want to know the limitations of your design, examine the whole picture, and use the patterns that exist to use in designing what we're trying to create. So, okay, produce more waste, or produce no produce no waste. Waste not, want not. Now, one of the things I like about permaculture is there's the re's, R-E. There's so many words that start with R-E that have to involve what we think about in permaculture. Rethink, reduce, repair, reuse, redesign, repurpose, recycle, regenerate. There's so many of these words that encompass what we're trying to do. And you put up some other ones. Let's see.
I think the next one is here: use and value renewable resources and services.
Okay. Yeah, we've talked about that a lot. You want to use locally sourced. Embodied energy needs to be considered when determining renewability and sustainability. How long will it take to grow a new computer? How much materials and energy will it take to produce a new one? Unlike most resources, plants and animals are not only renewable, but regenerative. They replace themselves. So that's the ultimate in renewable resources. Examples of this principle use biological resources. Fruit and nut trees, manures, compost, draft animals, worm composting, solar, wind, and photovoltaic systems use renewable resources, but they themselves are not renewable. Some people would argue that using earth-moving machines and large machinery to shape the landscape is unsustainable and a big no-no. But Bill Mollison has spoken about how if you can use, although there's a lot of embodied energy in building a big piece of machinery like an earth mover, look at the benefits that to generations in the future of using that once on a land to reshape your landscape and to make it so that energies are used more wisely and that you can grow more and produce more and sustain life on that piece of land for hundreds of years in the future. So you could say, yes, it burns petrol, and yes, it's made from a lot of embodied energy, but look at the argument, if you would, about after you design and use that piece of machinery, it's hundreds of years of production and value to future generations that are going to be had from you choosing to use that machine. So it's all in the way you use it. If you use that machine to tear down a mountaintop just to get coal at the bottom of it so you can burn it, that's a bad idea. That's That's a really bad idea. But if you use that to shape the landscape, to make it more productive, to support humans and animals and ecosystems, that's a pretty good
Oh, it's justified in that aspect. No, what I think when you mention that is like making swales with the excavator, where you then in long term you catch so much water and you improve the soil by planting, like someone mentioned, even also perennial plants. You mentioned trees, looking at the long-term equations and long-term regenerative and energy equation. That's basically important. And one thing that again came into my mind when you mentioned this use and valuable resources, hemp again. When you think about hemp again, there was another example where they said on 1 acre in 4 months growth period, you can capture 10 tons of CO2. That's already pretty crazy. And thinking of these kind of materials is what we have to do. Yeah, when we think of how much energy do we need to get them, to remanufacture them, and then also to dispose them, and that's where we have to go into basically natural economics. And now a big topic is also bioplastic, and someone mentioned it. It must not necessarily be higher costs or more energy. Like I saw companies now producing bioplastics based on red beets. Yeah, and red beets, to grow red beets is not so difficult. And maybe the extraction process is maybe a bit more complex, but digging for oil and fighting wars for petrol is basically more costly than growing red beets and making bioplastics from red beets. Yeah? And yeah, later on we have a nice example also of a t-shirt company, but I don't want to spoil that. So we see how these kind of ideas of growing and then making standard products is already in place. So now let's go. I think there's one more principle we have here on the slides, and yeah, we had that already earlier, but again, I leave it to you.
All right. So natural patterns are nature's way of structuring and organizing ecosystems. Natural patterns can be found at all scales. In permaculture design, we learn to notice patterns, and by observing the patterns that we see, we can design elements and systems that work in concert with the patterns of energy and materials they are embedded in or interacting with. So some examples of observing and replicating natural patterns would be systems that are shaped to use the shape of natural patterns. Spirals, a honeycomb is a good example of a natural pattern. Branching, as we see in rivers and the veins, nervous system. Biomimicry inspired, anything that comes from natural. And in the case of natural building, passive solar house design would be an example of looking at natural patterns and using those energies just as nature does. So now these are some examples here. The one black and white one is a zone map showing a homestead and how different elements can be added. That's from Bill Mollison's book, The Permaculture Designer's Manual. And on the right, you see an actual permaculture design that a student created for their homestead. And you can see all those different elements are located specifically to reduce human work and to have one element feed into another. So you can see where the compost and the chicken coop on the left are located right next to the vegetable garden. There's a reason for that. is because all of those materials are going to go from one to the next in a no waste loop, which goes to improving nutrient um, production in the food you're growing, and also regenerating the soil and growing more chickens, for instance. But all of those elements you see there can be placed to maximize the connections, just like we were talking about the web of life and how everything's connected. We are designing it so that things are connected, like the Three Sisters, Alice, yeah, Three Sisters planning. So we design things to be interconnected in a way that maximizes um, the products, reducing human waste and reducing human work. Um, and down at the bottom there, that's just an example of a diverse polyculture is another term you'll hear a lot. And that's basically lots of different diversity in the growing systems that you have. The more diversity you have, the healthier the systems are. Someone looking at that polyculture garden picture below might say, that's a mess, because it doesn't look like the typical manicured English garden where everything has its own place and it's separated by 1 meter of soil on all sides. You know, but they don't understand that's not the way nature works. So the way nature works is having diverse actors all working together in one symphony, in an orchestra, creating abundance in a natural way. So over time, you'll get used to enjoying and appreciating the way that natural systems look. And it's just more pleasing on the eye. And there's a reason for that, is because our human brains over millennia know instinctively when we see a natural system that's producing abundance that is good for us.
And talking about housing, we see actually what happens when we don't design having these energies in mind. Yeah? When we think about what happened during the 70s in many industrialized countries, they started building houses, big blocks, big cement blocks, just to maximize space where people can live. But what happened? They have such a high energy balance, because first all the materials that have to go there, and then they were just put somewhere without having in mind where the wind is coming from, when is the sun, where, when is the water, where, and all these then create extra costs in cooling, heating, restorating, and things like that. So when you do have not these things in mind, you create such a high waste and such a high energy use. Instead, when you are smarter in building, like many people or some architects and some movements, when we think of passive housing and other natural buildings, they have these things in mind. But ideally, when we look at when we stay back to this picture with the permaculture side, where you put your house matters. How you oriented it towards sun, wind, and everything else matters a lot. And that then later on has positive effects. So that's why this analysis of the elements, their needs, and then the energy flows are so important for us to then maintain our energy balance low. The other day, me and Enzo had a chat, and we were talking about rooftop gardening. And many people in the city say, hey, rooftop gardening is super cool. And I also like it, but then I remember your comment is like, such a high energy balance. You have to put all the soil first on the rooftop, and then the water, and things like that. So thinking of an overall balance, maybe rooftop gardening per se is not always the recommended choice. But anyways, it's also another thing we can discuss. But that's more or less, you see now the eyes of a permaculture designer, things of energies, things of interconnections, and harmony, like you said. And all of you, when there's no harmony and no flow, somehow you feel it. And when you see this building skyscrapers where people are just packed in, somehow we know it doesn't feel right. So this should already get us some idea. Let's see, next slide. More practical examples, basically, and then we have another possibility to have some questions before we then actually round up, and we give you a little bit of an exercise for home. Let's see, there's another comment. Okay, yeah, so nice comment from Alice. She's saying, I read that an appropriately placed tree in the landscape can lower the temperature in your house on a hot day by 2 degrees. I mean, that is crazy, and you don't have any air conditioning. So that's a good example of how you can be smart when you design a living. Okay, and then
yeah, look at Rashmi's comments as well.
Yeah. There's another comment or question to you. What do you think most energy efficient way to use rooftops? Now we talked about rooftops. Good topic.
Okay, I don't recommend rooftop gardening or rooftop farming because although it sounds like a great idea, it involves a lot of human work and energy to get the materials up to the roof to perform those activities and to grow. And you need, particular depth of soil. You need contact with the earth in order to have nutrient dense crops. So you can say, well, I can bring all the earth up to the rooftop, but then you're going to have a problem with the weight of the roof. I mean, even with a green roof, what I do recommend for roofing is a green roof. So you can have a minimal amount of soil that is there with layers that protect the structure and grow grass, wildflowers. You can do things like wildflower gardens or pollinator gardens that would support the bee populations and insects, but not farming, because you would need a depth of soil that is just, you would need such strong walls and structure to keep that going, to keep that from falling down. That is unsustainable. And the work involved in getting materials up and down from the roof in that kind of scenario is just too much. But a green roof is excellent idea, and you see that being used in Australia and lots of places to a higher extent every day, because it moderates temperature and helps increase oxygen content in the cities. So green roof, good. Rooftop farming, not so much.
Yeah, Alice mentioned earth ships, and they sometimes have these kind of design you mentioned with grass, moss, wildflowers on top. So yeah, it's like you said, can be a good thing, and lowering the temperature of the house, and also maintaining the structure in a better state. Okay, so is there another? Okay, before we go into the question, I would say let's just go quickly on the examples, and then we have basically all time for Q&As. We have here some best practice examples on product design, because we started with design thinking, talking about products, then we dip deep into permaculture, and obviously we think more of homesteading, designing a farm. But earlier we had the question, what about packaging industry? And here we actually see a cool example of a biodegradable food package, and we have shoes and a t-shirt, and I leave it to Enzo to comment some more.
Right, we can make sustainable packaging out of a wide range of agricultural waste materials, corn husks, rice hulls, hemp, things that normally aren't brought to market can be used to create packaging. And fully biodegradable. And there's absolutely no reason why we should be using virgin plastic made from crude oil to make packaging. Absolutely no reason. On the right, you'll see some shoes that are made from recycled tires. It's a great use for recycled tires. There's a big worldwide problem with tires being in the dumps, in the landfills, and filling up space and nothing being done with them. I do not recommend using tires for structures anywhere near food growing operations. In the case of earth chips, it's used as the structure for walls, but it's encapsulated. So there's no off-gassing or leaching of chemicals into the soil because it's packed in, and there's no water, running near or around the tires to produce that kind of problem. So that's a great solution. Earth chips are a great solution to the tire problem. At the bottom, you see a t-shirt company called TS Designs. This is probably the 100% most sustainable t-shirt company. I'm friends with Eric Henry, the CEO, and they're in Asheville, North Carolina. These guys have, from the beginning to the end, the most sustainable way of making t-shirts, I think, in the world. There's another company in the UK that is using 100% recycled cotton, and TS Designs in Asheville. They have a farm right on the property, and they grow the crops that they use to create their own dyes for all the coloring on their t-shirts. So every piece of that operation is sustainable and a great example for people who are in the business of product design, and who are interested in design thinking and taking it to the next level.
Okay, yeah, we have a couple of questions, so let's just go to the next one. We go back to the rooftop. Actually, there was the question, if sited appropriately, Leah asks, would not rooftop solar and rainwater capture make the most sense? To make use of the rooftops, basically, I guess is the question.
Yes. I mean, those are all solutions. It depends on, like we said, the situation, what the needs are, but definitely using rooftops for rainwater collection. You can have solar panels and rainwater collection in the same system. In other areas, maybe surrounding buildings, you can have green buildings. Basically, if the structure is not strong enough to support a green roof, then you could use those roofs as to hold solar panels and to do rainwater harvesting. So if you designed a city block, you can imagine that some of them would have solar, and all could have rainwater harvesting, but some of the flat, maybe industrial kind of buildings would be better having green roof, because those kind of situations, they may not be inclined to use rainwater harvesting unless, their whole system is designed to be sustainable.
And talking about, yeah, rainwater harvesting for me is one of my passions, to be honest, because
Yeah.
I'm living here in a very dry area, and it's similar to desert farming. So we have high temperatures, but high humidity, and when it rains, it can rain a lot. So it's difficult. So we want to save as much water as we can. And there's obviously different ways to harvest rainwater, and you can think of any surface can serve as rainwater harvesting, like not only the rooftops, but think of if you have a terrace, for example. Here at my place, the terraces, like where we stand on, are just so slightly inclined that the whole terrace is rainwater catching, and then it leads to a tank. It's not the rooftop, actually. It's any kind of surface can be used, and you don't have to make it completely flat. Make it a little runoff, and you can harvest so much rainwater. And also good examples like streets. Yeah, so much water goes to waste when it rains. I see that every time, and I think, how can I divert that water from the street to go into my place? Because there's so much water, and many times nature really provides what we need. Our challenge is then just how do we store that? And yeah, for me, rainwater harvesting is like one of my my passions, to be honest. Yeah, and obviously solar panels. We live in a place with so much solar power. We here in Spain we need to do that actually. But it's funny how like energies can become a solution or a problem. Yeah, thinking of sunlight can be too much, and then again in permaculture we think, what do we have too much of, and we need to balance stuff. Yeah, when you have too much water, you have to think of how can you avoid that your place gets too wet. If you have too much wind, you have to think of how can you stop the wind to make the climate more yeah, favorable for growing crops. Too much sunshine means you maybe need some shade, so you might want to grow some trees that grow fast to then provide shade, so you can then start planting in the semi or in the shade. So these are the things we always have to consider, and that's basically the main problem with normal design. Those things are not taken in consideration. It's just focusing on maximize output per unit, whether it is workers, whether it's land or animals. And that's the problem. They're not taking in a holistic approach, and that's where we have the problem with the cattle, with the chickens, with workers, with everything basically, because these interconnectedness is not taken into consideration, and the energy analysis is not done properly. Someone mentioned earlier in the chat life cycle analysis, perfect term. When we think of the life cycle analysis, for those that don't know, look at the whole cycle of a product from cradle to grave, but we want to avoid the grave basically. So from the grave going back to the cradle. That's why we call it circular economy or circular processes. And the life cycle analysis looks really from taking out the resources to disposing the resources. And there's techniques to calculate that, but you don't need to have all that super knowledge mathematically to calculate the life cycle. But having a life cycle analysis glasses basically you look through helps a lot for you to start thinking in long term and in processes. Having that view on the life cycle is yeah, really important. Yeah, more questions for from you guys? Because if not, then we can yeah, go to the question actually we have for you. Yeah, we have a little exercise for you at home. And if you want to, we offer the chance also to get a certificate for today, which includes a little online exam too, which you can do afterwards if you want to. I will explain that later. And if you want feedback on that question, you would have to enroll into the exam. But if not, you can take it as a sporty exercise to take home with. Think of a product or an item that you use every day. Let it be the hair dryer or the cell phone or the computer or whatever it is. And applying those principles we talked about today, how would it change that product, or what problems do you associate now with that product, not having in mind the topics we mentioned above. Take that to your workplace, obviously right now virtually I guess, and discuss it in your home with your friends. I think this is a great way to start thinking how to change things and what maybe not to get. So you might, if you then maybe see a product that you use every day and you see, oh, the packaging can't be recycled, or I have a cell phone, for example, and the materials in that cell phone are problematic. So these are things for us now to think about and find alternatives, and there are alternatives, and we need to look for them. So this is the next little exercise for you to take home with. Yeah, what can I how can I apply permaculture principles to my everyday living, and what are the problems if they are not applied to my everyday living? Basically, that's more or less the contemplation exercise. Would you like to add something, Enzo, or is that more or less how you would put it too?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that's good.
Then
I just want to add that in terms of design thinking, you know, we're talking about sustainable design and how things are moving much more towards sustainable design, and people are walking away from companies that are doing things in an unsustainable manner. So more and more we see product designers coming to learn about permaculture and get certified and bring that knowledge back to their companies. We see even landscape architects who are normally not knowledgeable in some of this stuff, getting certified in permaculture and bringing that to their landscape architect practices and getting a lot more business because of it, because they have, you know, these systems and new tools for their toolbox. So this is the end result is permaculture design, and we hope that, you know, you'll go to permacultureeducation.org and ask us any questions and take the course. Help save the world. Become a permaculture designer.
I can only recommend that. I did the course myself because I knew bits and pieces about permaculture from watching YouTube videos, reading books, and so on, but I still didn't get the whole idea how to do a design. I still didn't feel like I knew it all. Obviously, I still don't know it all, of course, but after taking the course, these little dots and bits and pieces I had before, all of a sudden made sense. And that was one of the questions earlier we had. What can I do to start something from scratch? For me, having taken that course is excellent because no matter which site I go to, I could just redo the homeworks Enzo gave me, and with that I come up with my whole design. And that's actually the cool part of this course. It will give you lots of practical exercises for you to do at your place. For example, one thing I found super fun is taking a glass jar, putting some soil in there, taking water, shaking it, and letting it sit down. So you see the different layers of clay and sand and whatever hummers you have or not have. And these kind of practical exercises you can do wherever you are, whether you're living in a house or you're living on a farm, and you get the ideas, and you can do many things without having your own farm already. Thinking of energy analysis, you can sit on a balcony and observe where's the sun going, where's the wind coming, when is the wind coming, all these things. You take notes and you have interaction with the teachers, and you send them their homeworks and they give you great feedback. And the best part about it is it's like a Lego picture. Yeah, you have different homeworks, and each homework is like a Lego stone, which then all put together form a final design, which is part of the course. You have to make your own final design, whether it's your house or someone else's farm or whatever it is. You can choose basically. But the cool thing is that every homework already is part of the main exercise. And once you know these different steps to take, then you can go to another site and you know what to do. You're not going there and not knowing what you have to do. You will start observing, you will start looking at what are the resources, what elements do I have, how are the elements connected or not. And this is the kind of mindset and view you get from this design course. So I really, everybody who's serious about permaculture should go through this course, because books cannot teach you that kind of knowledge alone. It's harder, I guess, because you need the interaction with teachers that know already what they've been doing. And that's the great part about permaculture education and permaculture college, which is yeah, another thing you can mention if you want to. This is a great network of people that know so much about permaculture, that have been working in that long time, experts from all over the world, and you get a super cool feedback. And that's basically what I appreciated the most. And yeah, I hope I got that right. I'm still fascinated by that course. So I can only recommend you go to the website, and like you said, whatever question you have, there's also an introductory course. Yeah, so if you have more questions, feel free to ask Enzo anything. One thing I would like to mention for today, we had some questions in the forefields. You are able to get a certificate for this course, which is not the webinar alone. If you want to, you can enroll for an online exam, which will give you certain questions you will have to fill out, and you will have a little reading, which you also will need to answer some questions about. And that's the way you can earn your certificate. It has a little administration fee of 15 euros. Why? Because actually our courses and webinars are supposed to plant trees. And yeah, this comes with some costs, obviously, and we need to invest in stuff, and the teachers need to revise the exams. So it's a little administration fee, and you're supporting a great course. You would get 2 certificates. Actually, one is for planting the trees, with the GPS data from where they are planted, and a certificate for qualifying or training. You can call it continuing education. It's not an official continuing education certificate, but it's like we certify that you took part of the training, and some people like that to build your resume. So it's not an obligation, but if you want to get a certificate for today's event, feel free to contact us, and you can write us an email and just put in certificate and online exam, or go back to Eventbrite where you got the tickets in the first place and grab the ticket that includes the fee. That's how you support us, and that's the way we can keep rolling and give you free stuff and support planting trees. And here you have more resources if you would like to know more on design thinking, for example, cradle to cradle, biomimicry, systems designs. You can have a look at our school. You can look at ANSO's website and what they do. And yeah, there's one question before I close from Alice. Yes, it's a distance learning course, and that's great about that course of ANSO's. It can be done also on a low technical base. Basically, originally you mentioned it's designed it was designed by Mollison that it could be handed out in paper, basically on a correspondence kind of base. Nowadays, obviously, it's more sophisticated and has more elements, but the idea is that you, from wherever you are able to do the course and with the course book, and send the answers back via email, and you get your feedback via email on your homeworks and the final design. And yeah, it is really practical.
It's a standard 72-hour course that is taught worldwide. And we have people teaching on the ground courses as well as online courses, but the material is the same. So whether you sit through lectures on the ground at a site and go through the course and have it through lecture, or if you take it online and you go through the material yourself, it should be the same 72-hour material. And that's how we make sure that it's internationally recognized. So you get your certificate from taking that course, and people all over the world will recognize what knowledge you have and skills and value.
Okay, so yeah, I'll keep the last slide. We are actually done with the webinar today. I thank everybody a lot, especially you, Enzo. But before we leave, if there's any question that we didn't answer, please write it now. Obviously, you can write us questions afterwards too. We're still here, but now is the chance to interact still. But if there's no more questions, also good. But there's now another chance to ask us a question. There's one which I don't understand completely. How about rooftop photovoltaic agriculture? Yeah, maybe you can say something to that.
Yeah, the question earlier was rooftop farming versus using the rooftop for solar and water harvesting. You know, it depends on the situation. It depends on the structure. So you could definitely have solar panels and some type of small growing system on the roof. But again, you have to be careful because of the weight involved in the growing systems that you're installing. So I recommend green roofs or solar panels and water harvesting. Water harvesting is very, very valuable, and in a lot of cases more valuable than doing a green roof. But in places that are arid, hot, especially in the middle of the city where you have square buildings with flat roofs, having a green roof is a very good idea.
Okay, before I forget it, I mentioned it earlier. Now on the chat, I will give you the chance. Now it's uploading. I'm uploading the ebook that Enzo mentioned earlier. So you have a reader of today's webinar, more information, more pictures, and definitely more text. So if you want to go more into depth about what we talked today, design thinking and natural systems, permaculture principles, you have great information there. It should be soon uploaded. I will also send it out afterwards via email, of course, and we will also have this show of today I will upload, it's recorded and we'll upload it to YouTube. So once everything is set, you get an email with the ebook and also with the link to the YouTube. So if you want to go back, you can always watch it. And also if you then obviously do the online exam, you have all the questions, or you have all the materials then also to answer the questions, because for doing the online exam, you will need the reader, you will need some of the recordings, because obviously the test is associated with what we've been talking about today. So you have great materials, and yeah, thank you so much for everybody's time and attendance and interest. So hopefully see you again, and take care, stay healthy. That's the main part, I guess, today. And yeah, talk soon. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a good day.